The black pilot was told by airline staff to wait outside for a few minutes before shutting down the entire company. Catherine Hayes had always been known as an excellent pilot, someone who people said flew like she was born with wings. But that morning, at Horizon Airlines headquarters, those wings were broken by a single sentence. "Captain Hayes, we need you in the hallway." She never expected that those words would start a chain of events that would lead to the downfall of one of America's oldest airlines, not because of an accident in the sky, but because of the weight of corruption and discrimination in the industry. Catherine stepped out of the crew lounge, the cool air from O'Hare touching her skin. Only 37, but with over 15,000 hours of flight time, she walked with the confidence that only seasoned pilots possess. Her uniform was neat, the 4 yellow stripes on her sleeves reflecting the electric lights, her suitcase sliding across the tile floor. She checked her watch. 5:17 a.m. The meeting for XR27 to San Francisco was scheduled to start at 5:30, giving her plenty of time to grab a cup of coffee from the lounge. Today was more special than ever. After months of interviews and tests, today was her first day as a captain at Horizon Airlines, one of the country's most prestigious airlines. But Catherine sensed something different in the air. A strange sense of unease. The lounge door opened, and the aroma of coffee wafted out. Inside, pilots and flight attendants were discussing the flight, occasionally checking their phones. When Catherine walked in, all eyes were on her. There was a moment of silence, and she could feel the difference. Not everyone was accepting of a female pilot, especially a black woman like her. As soon as Catherine entered the cockpit, the atmosphere became heavier. Captain James Turner, a man with more than 30 years of flying experience, sat firmly in the control seat. He looked up and curled his lips, but did not say a word of greeting. His arm reached out, pulled out the flight checklist, then turned away, not looking Catherine in the eye. Catherine was used to being judged on first glance, but this was different. Turner's lack of friendliness sent a chill through the cockpit. Though she had braced herself for a challenging first day, she had not expected a colleague to be so cold. Catherine tried to start the conversation with a friendly greeting. "Hello, Captain Turner. It's a pleasure working with you today." Turner didn't respond immediately, his eyes still glued to the control panel. After a long pause, he spoke, his voice dry, as if he were talking to a stranger. "We'll do it now. You follow the procedure as you learned it. I don't want to have to supervise everything." Catherine felt the contempt in his words, but she kept her composure. This flight would be her chance to prove herself, and she would not let another person's discomfort interrupt her work. As Turner continued his work, Catherine looked out the cockpit window at the distant dawn light, painting the sky a pale blue. She wondered how many other female pilots had faced such a cold shoulder on their journeys. Those thoughts were quickly dismissed when she heard the announcement from ground control. "Flight XR27 is ready for takeoff. Crews, please prepare." Despite the uneasiness that was rising in Catherine's heart, she still raised her hands to grip the steering wheel tightly. She couldn't let her emotions control this job, couldn't let unfriendly looks or words stop her. This was her chance, and she wouldn't let it pass. This flight will be a milestone, not only because it will be her first time flying this plane as a captain, but also because it will be a turning point to prove that she can overcome any challenge, whether from her colleagues or from the discriminatory system she is facing. From the moment Catherine stepped into the cockpit, she sensed something was wrong. Not because of a mechanical problem, but because of a subtle change. Something indescribable that made the air around her feel thick, as if someone had turned down the temperature just to test her. Laughter died down. Conversations stopped as if her presence were unexpected. No one said anything, and the silence spoke louder than any words. The glances, seemingly casual, were full of consideration and scrutiny. No one openly insulted her. But she knew. The way they exchanged glances when she turned away, the way they avoided touching the object she had just touched, all were familiar signals she had learned to recognize since she was very young. And at 30,000 feet, on a so-called professional flight, they followed her like an endless shadow. Catherine didn't say anything, never did. She knew the rules. She knew that, for a black woman, a strong reaction would be misinterpreted as aggression, as a lack of control, as not fitting into a calm and professional environment. So she kept quiet. But it wasn't resignation, it was control. It was her way of maintaining the right to tell her story her way. She adjusted her collar, raised her head, and continued her work with the cold precision of someone who knew her place. Not because someone else had given it to her, but because she had claimed it long ago. No one had given her this place. She had earned it, with every class, every test, every overnight flight, when her body was tired, but her eyes were glued to the controls. The isolation she felt today did not surprise her. She had learned to live with it, but not accept it. Because beneath the neat uniform, behind the name tag clearly printed with the title, was a strong heart that had never let others define her worth. Catherine was not an icon. She was a person, with abilities, with courage, and with a dream that no amount of doubting eyes could diminish. The air in the cockpit was now as quiet as the surface of water before a storm. The steady beeping of the control panel seemed to be the only thing that broke the silence between them. Catherine stood there, no longer the woman who hid behind a professional mask to avoid disturbing the invisible order, but a pilot with title, experience, and dignity, facing her captain as an equal, not asking to be heard but demanding respect. She took a deep breath, not for courage, it had been there for a long time, but to keep her voice calm, steady, unwavering by the emotions churning in her chest. "Captain Turner," she began, her eyes unwavering, each word coming out as slowly as a knock on a door that had been closed for too long. "I think we need to talk." He turned his head, not taking his eyes off the radar screen for a split second, but enough to chill the air a few degrees. She didn't wait for permission. Catherine was tired of waiting for others to acknowledge her existence as a condition for being heard. She continued, this time with the calmness of someone who no longer feared being misunderstood. "Throughout the flight, I sensed a distinct lack of respect. Not just from the crew, but from him. No one said it out loud, but I'd been flying long enough to know what was going on when I was left out of discussions, when eyes weren't on me, when I was treated like an intern instead of someone who was keeping 200 people alive." Captain Turner was silent. He did not object. He did not agree. He did not deny. But that silence was the confirmation Catherine needed. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm just asking for what I deserve. I'm the first pilot on this flight. I have the same training as you. I have the same certification as you, and I have the same responsibilities as you. So I have the right to demand respect. Not because I'm a woman, not because I'm black, but because I'm a pilot, equal to you." For the first time since the flight began, Turner's eyes met hers. There was no coldness or disdain. There was surprise, not that she had spoken, but that she had dared to speak with a calmness that made it impossible to argue. Her anxiety had melted away, replaced by something more tangible than anything else, the strength of someone who no longer wanted to shrink to fit other people's expectations. Catherine didn't wait for a response. She turned back in her seat, buckled her seatbelt, and placed her hands on the controls as if the conversation had never happened. Because she knew that the weight of her words would not dissipate with the pressurized cabin, but would linger in the air as a reminder. From now on, she would no longer be silent. One morning, 3 days after the flight, Catherine was summoned to the operations office, a cold white space with fluorescent lights that cast a shadow on the floor, as if everything there were designed to make people feel small. On the desk was a cold cup of coffee and a brief memo printed from the intercom, still smelling of ink. The man sitting across from her was Mr. Wallace, the crew chief, who was known for his polite to the point of being emotionless way of speaking. "Catherine," he began, his voice as calm as if he were about to announce a change in the in-flight snack menu. "The airline has decided to adjust your duties for future flights. There will be some, mostly temporary shifts in which you will no longer be primarily responsible for intercontinental routes. We find it more beneficial to have you focus on domestic support and training new staff." There was no clear explanation, not a line that this was the result of the confrontation with Captain Turner. But to Catherine, no one needed to say it. She understood. The way Mr. Wallace avoided her eyes when he spoke, the way he used more favorable instead of demotion, the way he put the note down on the table as if to say, "All set." It was all too clear. In that moment, Catherine felt as if everything she'd worked for, the sleepless nights, the hours of training in flight simulators, the rigorous psychological testing, had been wrapped up in a sheet of paper that had no room for dreams. She didn't get angry. She didn't scream. But deep inside, there was a silent cut. She was hurt, not just by being overlooked, but by the idea that they could quietly, unnoticed, put her back in her place, as if no one had ever dared to cross that unspoken line. Catherine stood up and thanked Mr. Wallace in a strangely calm voice, because she knew that if she let injustice take over her mind, she would lose herself. Leaving the office, she did not go straight home, but stood for a moment in the hallway where the sunlight filtered through the large glass doors. A soft light, but enough to clearly show the dust that still floated in the air, like the invisible prejudices she faced every day. But then she smiled. A smile meant for no one but herself. The smile of someone who had decided, if they wanted her to back down, they would have to watch Catherine go on. Not in anger, but in courage. Not in silence, but in unquenchable determination. At first, Catherine thought it was a personal issue, an isolated confrontation between her and Captain Turner, a man who was not used to seeing a woman of color in a cockpit, let alone sitting next to him in the driver's seat. But as the work schedules grew more blurred, as the internal meetings became cold and unseeing, and as the unanswered messages turned to silence, she understood. What was happening was no accident. Catherine began to look more closely. In crew meetings, she noticed that the names of women, especially those from minority backgrounds, were routinely left off the list for long-haul flights, transoceanic assignments, and promotion training. The seemingly innocuous priority candidates' emails were sharp, but politically correct language. And then, sitting alone in the archives one evening after a flight, Catherine stumbled upon a copy of an internal analysis, not publicly available, that discussed cultural fit when selecting crew representatives for international events. There was no one on the priority list who looked like her, not once. The pieces began to fall into place. What seemed like random decisions followed a chillingly precise implicit logic. Female pilots were assigned to less stressful domestic flights, advanced training opportunities were rarely mentioned, and anyone who spoke up was given a temporary transfer, an unstated demotion. The injustice was unwritten, but deeply embedded in the operating structure, where people like her were never truly considered a central part of the machine. At first, there was surprise. Then there was a sharp pang of disappointment, not because she hadn't seen it coming, but because some part of her had hoped she'd been wrong. But now that the truth was so clear, Catherine could no longer afford to look away. A new feeling began to rise, not impulsive anger, but quiet resolve. The kind that can only come from those who have hit rock bottom and decided not to stay there. Catherine understood. If she remained silent, things would go exactly as they wanted. Her presence would fade into the background, erased from the airline's history like a footnote. But if she stood up, not just for herself, but for all the people who had walked these corridors unseen, then perhaps, for the first time, someone would stop and listen. Catherine had thought that silence was the way to survive, that if she just did her job well, things would change over time. But after what she had seen, cold decisions disguised as bureaucratic language, opportunities denied her because of her gender or skin color, indifferent looks when she walked into a meeting room, as if her presence were a mistake that needed to be fixed. Catherine knew that silence only made things worse. And this time, she chose differently. She chose to speak up. At first, it was just individual conversations with colleagues who had seen it, but never dared to speak to it. She spoke not in an angry tone, but with an undeniable sincerity. When she described being left off the duty list without explanation, the time she was called by the wrong title in business class, the suspicious look a supervisor gave her when she entered the cockpit. And gradually, the truth began to be heard, because it came not from a troublemaker, but from someone who had endured long enough to know that change doesn't come without someone brave enough to initiate it. Catherine began to piece together the evidence. unusual common denominators in flight schedules, missed conversations, and employees who had left quietly after their dreams were shattered by the secret policy. She sent an internal report to the board, anonymously. She knew that if she wanted to change, she had to dare to put her name at the bottom of what she wrote. And then, the most surprising thing happened. A few other voices spoke up. A female first officer who had been kicked out of training because she had just given birth, an Asian male flight attendant who had been rejected as a cabin crew chief because he didn't fit the brand image. People who had thought they were alone began to find each other. And for the first time in years, the crew corridor became not just a place of silent passing, but a space for dialogue and alliance. Catherine didn't seek fame. She didn't want to be an icon. What she wanted was fairness, a simple thing that had been pushed aside by false priorities and an operating culture that had been in place since before she was born. But as she stood in the middle of a crew meeting, her eyes locked on the executives, her voice calm but firm as she laid out what could no longer be denied, it was clear to everyone, she was no longer an outsider. She was the center of a transformation. Catherine felt the fear still there. She was not made of steel. But amid the trembling of her heart was an unmistakable pride. Not because she thought she was any better than anyone else, but because she knew, this time, she had chosen the right thing. And there was nothing more humbling than that. No one really knows what the moment of coming out of the shadows will look like. Will it be a standing ovation from a packed auditorium, or admiring glances from doubters? But for Catherine, it came more quietly, when she was ushered into the CEO's office early one morning, where she was no longer seen as a minority pilot who needed to be managed, but as an equal, someone who had made the system look at itself. The notice that followed was barely 2 pages long, but within each line was a quiet acknowledgement that Catherine had been waiting to hear for a long time. She was being appointed Director of Flight Training for North America, not just for her skills, but for her influence. The first black woman in the company's history to hold the position. But when her photo was circulated on the internal newsletter, it wasn't the title that got people talking. It was her calm gaze and her smile that held no triumph, just the serenity of someone finally being accepted for who she was. At an international aviation conference, where executives and pilots from around the world gathered, Catherine stepped up to the podium to accept the Pioneer of the Year award. Her speech was neither long nor boastful. She simply told her story in the deep voice that had guided hundreds of flights through the clouds. She did not name any of the people she had hurt, nor did she detail the injustices she had endured. She spoke of change, of why a little girl who had sat behind an airport glass window, looking up at the sky, never gave up on her dream of being in a cockpit. And when she ended with a simple sentence, "I am not here to be the exception. I am here to be the precedent." The audience stood up, not because she was an icon, but because she had made them ask themselves, have they helped build an industry they can be proud of? In the days that followed, Catherine became the face of a new training campaign focused on equality and inclusion. But she didn't mind the spotlight. She spent more time mentoring young pilots, especially girls of color, who had thought the cockpit was a place reserved for people other than themselves. During each practice session, she patiently corrected them, reminding them that confidence doesn't come from being given an opportunity, but from believing you deserve it in the first place. One late afternoon, as Catherine stood alone in front of the glass windows of her new office, watching the planes land and take off in the golden sunset, she felt something she had never felt before. Peace. Not because she had won against anyone, but because she had not given up on herself, and somehow that had opened the door for so many others to follow. Catherine never saw herself as a hero, but in the silent glances at her from down the hall, in the thank you messages from young pilots sent late at night, she understood that sometimes, to change the world, you don't have to shout. You just have to stand. Story is a powerful reminder that, while discrimination may be happening silently in seemingly insignificant moments, we have the power and the authority to change it. Every small act can be a spark that can ignite great change. And when we dare to stand up for justice, when we continue to fight for mutual respect, we will be the ones leading the way to a more just and humane world. What about you? Have you ever felt ignored in a space where you deserved respect? Will you stay silent, or will you speak up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to hear your story. If this story makes you think, don't forget to like, share to spread this message, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow the next inspirational journey. Because sometimes, all it takes to change a whole system is one person sitting in the right seat.